Oh, hi everyone, it's James here. How you all doing? Okay, so today I'm going to do something a bit different. I've just finished watching a video by Martin Harris, who is a new person to me on YouTube. Check him out. I'll link to his channel. He's doing some great videos. He's on a bit of a voyage of discovery. He's working his way through all the classic albums, you know, these records which we're all told to listen to because they're kind of great, and he's working his way through them, and he's listening to them, and he's giving a reaction on camera, not while he's listening but afterwards. And he did a great one on The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, which is the one I've just watched, and it was such an interesting video to me, as somebody who's grown up with Pink Floyd's music, and I've studied it and read about it, and Martin was coming to it with reasonably fresh ears, I think, and he wasn't all that keen on it. He liked the album, but he didn't love it, and it was clear from listening to what he was saying that he wasn't aware of any of the kind of backstory to the record, any of the history. He was freely admitting that. I think the thing he was trying to express, I think, is this idea that you come to music which has got a big reputation or a big legacy behind it, and sometimes if you don't know that history and you're not aware of certain facts, it can make certain albums quite difficult to get into. Of course, knowing the facts and knowing the history is no guarantee that you're going to enjoy the music anymore, but it can help, you know. And that got me thinking about Pink Floyd and how they've got this massive legacy, and they're one of those bands that if you do come to them with completely fresh ears, it might be difficult to quite sort of understand what it is that you're listening to. Pink Floyd had so many different incarnations and went through so many different avenues in their career that it can be a mistake sometimes to think of it as just being this homogeneous continuum of music, whereas in fact you've got all these different phases. So I thought, what if I do a quick Pink Floyd primer, you know, some just certain things you have to know about Pink Floyd in order to be able to properly kind of understand the music. Not to like the music, like I said, I mean, you might understand all this stuff and still not develop a taste for the music, but it might help to know some of the history. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that you've got to be able to distinguish between the early Pink Floyd, which was led by Syd Barrett, and his kind of whimsical, quite sort of hippy-dippy but very literary songwriting. You know, he was a very poetic soul, and the songs he wrote were quite kind of innocent. They did have a slightly uncanny quality to them, but Syd's talent was all his own, really, and after he left the group, Pink Floyd had to change and adapt. So with Saucerful of Secrets on those early albums, the transitional albums, they were trying to feel their way, really, and I think they were still, in their minds, they were still plugged into the 60s counterculture where they'd been known as being a drug band. Obviously Syd had completely melted his brain with LSD. The other members of the group were not really into it, though. I think Rick Wright, the keyboard player, was quite into smoking a bit of ganja, and I think he'd taken acid a couple of times. But Roger Waters and Nick Mason were fairly straight. You know, they were both architects. I think Roger Waters said he'd taken drugs maybe twice in his life. He'd taken LSD twice in his life, and he hadn't enjoyed it at all. Nick Mason was fond of a drink, but again, he wasn't into psychedelics. So after Syd left, you know, they gradually cut away from the psychedelic explorations. They were still known as being a psychedelic band, and when David Gilmour came into the equation, originally he tried to make his guitar sound like Syd Barrett. He tried to imitate the kind of freak out stuff that Syd had done, and it took a while for him to develop his own sound. And you know, but I think by the time you get to Dark Side of the Moon, David Gilmour has got his own guitar sound, but his style is rooted in things like B.B. King. It's not particularly, his stuff is not that psychedelic. I don't think David Gilmour's guitar playing is any more psychedelic than Roger Waters' lyrics are. You know, I think they stopped being a psychedelic band. So that's the one thing I'd say, to understand, by the time you get to albums like Medal and The Dark Side of the Moon, Roger Waters was very, very impatient with the whole idea of Pink Floyd being a kind of like a remnant or a relic from the 60s hippie counterculture. Pink Floyd actually never really identified themselves very strongly with that movement. It was almost by chance that they became the house band at this really sort of hip club called the UFO Club in London, where lots of people were taking acid and, you know, really going off on one. But Pink Floyd were an ambitious rock band, really, from the start, and even though Syd Barrett, I think, had strongly identified with that underground movement, The others were not so bothered. So after Sid left and they got to Dark Side of the Moon, the main thing Roger Waters wanted to do was bring Pink Floyd down to earth with a bang. He'd started doing it lyrically on Medal, the previous album, with the track Echoes, but on Dark Side of the Moon he deliberately set out to write a piece that was about the pressures of modern life. And I think the crucial thing you have to understand about Floyd from 1972 or 3 onwards, you know, the kind of Dark Side period, you've got to understand, I think, Roger Waters came from a very, very political background. His mother was a member of the Communist Party. He was Roger Waters was a big, big left-wing guy. You know, he was into C&D and Ban the Bomb, and to this day, he's really active politically, and he's quite hard left still, even though he's very wealthy and everything. You know, I mean, he's been accused of being a champagne socialist, but I think to understand albums like Dark Side of the Moon, you've got to appreciate, I think, that he was a political songwriter. He saw himself as a political songwriter. He did not want to be identified with any of that hippy dippy astral plane stuff from the 60s. In the 1970s, he became more and more obsessed with this idea of mental ill health. Part of that was because Sid Barrett, the founding member of Pink Floyd, had such terrible drug problems, and I think that affected Roger quite badly. Because he'd been friends with Sid, and he saw the way that Sid's mind, you know, had disintegrated really under the pressures of LSD. But okay, so Wish You Were Here is largely on that theme of absence. I think Roger described it as it was an album about all the extremities of absence that people have to indulge in: absence from the world, absence from engagement with each other. In order to be able to cope with the kind of horrible nature of modern life. We sort of withdraw from it. We have a tendency to shield ourselves. I mean, he was heading in the direction of doing The Wall quite early on. You know, this idea that we encase ourselves in a shell, and that we don't. We try to avoid engaging with each other emotionally and psychologically. And obviously, you know, as a person who was very, very left-wing, and so therefore into the idea of collectivism and people power and everything like that, he found that very disturbing. And when you get to Animals, it's a rampantly political record, extremely, it's a kind of searing indictment of capitalism and individualism, then when he got to The Wall, obviously, he sort of reached a tipping point, really. I think it was everything that he saw around him that was wrong with the world, but it was also this inner journey where he'd kind of realised that he himself was collapsing as a person, and he was, I think all the pressures that he encountered being a rock star and trying to deal with the music business, you know, those kind of things had come through on Wish You Were Here. You know, the song Have a Cigar and Welcome to the Machine. Roger became a very, very cynical, jaded, embittered individual, and The Wall is a sort of, it's almost like a kind of monstrous outpouring, really, of all that kind of angst and anger. And that's why Pink Floyd, for me anyway, Pink Floyd become harder and harder to listen to as you get further into the 1970s. My favourite period of Floyd is the very early period up to Dark Side of the Moon, and I think after Dark Side of the Moon it just gets bleaker and bleaker and more difficult to stomach, really, if you pay attention to the lyrics. Now, musically, until we get to Animals, there was a sort of uneasy truce in the band, because even though Roger wanted to take the band into that very bleak, hard political direction, you had David Gilmour and Rick Wright, who were the musical members of the group, and they wanted to keep that very mellifluous, smooth, nice, kind of orchestrated kind of sound. Well, not orchestrated, because they didn't really use orchestrations, but, you know, just amazing arrangements and just making everything very audiophile. And it wasn't until they got to the Animals album that there was a bit of a falling out in the studio. Gradually, it was kind of starting to build, because Roger wanted everything very stripped back. You know, he didn't want any reverb on the vocals. He wanted the guitars dry and in your face, whereas Gilmour always wanted a bit of reverb and a bit of echo. And he kind of wanted, Gilmour and Wright wanted their listeners to float away, just like they had done in the 60s, you know, to the 60s Pink Floyd. They wanted them to have a kind of, not a hippie-trippy journey, but they wanted them to have some kind of, you know, relaxing experience, whereas Roger Waters, that was, you know, nothing could be further from his desire at the time. His desire was to wake people up and to get them to wake up and smell the roses, and to just to convey this political conviction he had. And eventually, of course, that's why the Floyd broke up, really, in the end, because there was no way to reconcile what Roger wanted with what the other band members wanted. And after Roger left the group, Pink Floyd went off into a totally different direction, and arguably they lost their teeth, you know, they lost their lyrics. They'd lost any sense of political engagement, and they lost a sense of narrative and a sense of real world concerns, and went back really to just being a bit of a soft rock group, really. So yeah, anyway, so hope that helps to anybody who's kind of is coming to Pink Floyd knowing some things about them. I think Martin had an idea about them, but I could tell that it was like a jigsaw puzzle. He'd not managed to click the pieces into place yet. Martin was talking about the spoken word excerpts on The Dark Side of the Moon and saying he didn't understand how they fitted into the record. So I was trying to explain in the comment section what that was all about. You know, Roger Waters had written all these questions on pieces of card, and he was going around asking people in the studio. You know, the doorman he asked. There was the Wings guitarist Henry McCulloch. And he was wanting to get very kind of candid responses back from people to questions such as when did you last hit somebody and were you in the right? Things like that, because he was very interested in the way that we become dehumanised, you know, through various pressures that come to bear on us from outside. And the theme of that record is that, really, and that's why those questions were asked. He wanted to have some kind of spoken word parts that would subtly enhance that that theme and message. This book is a great book to read if you want to know more about Pink Floyd. This is The Dark Side of the Moon by John Harris. It's only a very short book, so you can read it in an afternoon. But if you want to learn about The Dark Side of the Moon, Martin, and anybody else, that's the one to go for. And if you do decide that you just genuinely do not like Pink Floyd and you just don't get it at all, read this book. This is an hilarious book, Lost in Music by Giles Smith. It's like a memoir of this guy growing up in the 1970s and just being into pop music, but he didn't like Pink Floyd at all. And there's a really, really funny chapter in it where he and his friends listen to The Dark Side of the Moon in a darkened room, and it's just got a really funny climax to that chapter. There we go, job done. Check out Martin's channel, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.